Resuming the adjourned debate on the speech from the throne, I call on the member for Fredericton-South and leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise in the House and an honour to rise in the House to respond to the speech from the throne as leader of the Green Party and an MLA for Fredericton-South. I want to recognize that we work and gather here on the unceded and surrendered land of the Wolastoqey. The legal basis of our relationship with the Wolastoqey and the other First Nations in New Brunswick is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship enshrined in the Canadian Constitution. This means we're all treaty people, Mr. Speaker, so as New Brunswickers, we expect the provincial government to treat our treaty partners, the Wolastoqey, the Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy nations with respect and carry out our treaty obligations fully. Mr. Speaker, I toured our beautiful province before we returned to the Legislative Assembly, and what I heard from so many people was the sense that when it comes to public services, everything seems kind of broken. It reminds me of the Bob Dylan song where he's saying, "Seems like every time you stop and turn around, something else has just hit the ground. Broken hands on broken plows, broken treaties, broken vows, people bending broken rules, everything is broken." Even worse, Mr. Speaker, in the face of that sense that people have that everything is broken, what I heard from people was that they feel abandoned by their government. There's a strong sense that they're alone and are being left to fend for themselves in the face of many, many serious challenges. This is a puzzling throne speech for this moment in our history, Mr. Speaker. The Premier's message in the speech seems to be that everything is coming up roses for New Brunswickers. You know the song, clear the decks, clear the tracks, you got nothing to do but relax, blow a kiss, take a bow, honey, everything's coming up roses. Were it only true. When New Brunswickers were looking for a roadmap to hope in the throne speech, they got a show tune. Government used to do things to improve the quality of people's lives, Mr. Speaker, like ensuring that the safety net actually is able to catch people when they fall. It's not the case any longer. People living on the street, people living in their cars, people lined up in ambulances 6 rows deep. The safety net isn't working. Le gouvernement est censé défendre les droits des minorités en matière de langue, de culture et d'égalité. Pourtant, le Premier ministre a abandonné sa responsabilité envers les Premières Nations et les Acadiens et Acadiennes, faisant preuve à maintes reprises d'un manque de respect flagrant à leur égard. No inquiry into systemic racism, fear-mongering over our Aboriginal title, nothing but crickets when it comes to replying to the recommendations of the Official Languages Review Commissioners. And now he's appointed an MLA to his cabinet who opposes the equality of our 2 official linguistic communities, a right that's enshrined in the Constitution of our country, Mr. Speaker. Unbelievable. Mr. Speaker, we're living in an increasingly unstable world, yet right here at home we face a health crisis, a senior care crisis, an affordable housing crisis, a homelessness crisis, a climate crisis, an ecological crisis, a mental health crisis, an addictions crisis. It's a perfect storm, Mr. Speaker. Comment les gens sont-ils censés s'en sortir quand tout semble si brisé et que nous avons un Premier ministre qui pense que tout est rose? On ne voit que la vie en rose. Nurses leaving the bedside, Mr. Speaker, doctors leaving the province, paramedics leaving their ambulances, social workers leaving their profession, and personal support workers leaving their calling. Then, Mr. Speaker, there's public health, which is just missing in action. I know they haven't left. They're there. But why our medical officers of health are not free to speak as to the population, doctor to patient, is beyond me. Perhaps it's because it's the kind of thing that can get you fired in this province, Mr. Speaker, as Dr. Cleary painfully learned from the Liberals. Monsieur le Président, vous pensez peut-être que je dresse un tableau sombre, mais il suffit de regarder ce que le Premier ministre a fait de sa priorité numéro 1, l'élimination de l'immersion en français. une formation en langue seconde qui fonctionne réellement selon les données. French immersion is one thing, Mr. Speaker, that's not broken. Yet the Premier intends to slam the door to French immersion in the faces of students entering our school system for the first time this fall. Shameful. The Premier's decision on French immersion is clear-cut, Mr. Speaker, just like the Crown lands. The Crown forests have fallen silent because life has been squeezed out of them by the widespread use of clear-cutting and spraying of the plants and shrubs and trees that rapidly sprout up from the earth in a valiant effort to heal those massive clear cuts. Mr. Speaker, New Brunswick is a place where the rivers run. But clear-cutting and climate change means they run wild in the spring and run low and hot in the summer, sedimented and barren of salmon. Une longue portion de la berge le long de la rivière Arseneau a été gravement endommagée en 2018 et 2019 par de violentes crues printanières par une intense tempête de pluie hivernale. Cela a coûté beaucoup d'argent pour stabiliser les berges de la rivière et la renforcer contre les futurs dommages alimentés par le climat. Mr. Speaker, think of our land, sea and sky. Ever stronger hurricanes descend on us like Fiona, inflaming the sea, engulfing our coastal lands. Mr. Speaker, we hear that called the new normal, but with the climate crisis, with the climate deteriorating, this no near normal. It's just only going to get worse until we actually take meaningful action, Mr. Speaker. It's just a snapshot of what's happening now, and we can only expect stronger and more damaging storms than Fiona as climate change continues to grow out of control. We're running out of time, Mr. Speaker, to have an effect on the changing climate by any actions we might take. Scientists say by the end of this decade, if we don't take meaningful action, future actions will have little impact on the unraveling of our climate and the tremendous impacts that will have on everything from food supply to our health. So, Mr. Speaker, in New Brunswick, where are the early warning systems for communities along the coast? Why hasn't the province identified those communities most at risk from coastal flooding during storm surges? Where's the money to move people and infrastructure back from our shores in those areas most at risk? Where's the money to bring our health care and long-term care back from the brink, Madam Speaker? Eh bien, Madame la Présidente, le Premier ministre a remis plus d'1 milliard de dollars aux banquiers pour satisfaire son obsession de la dette provinciale. Priorities, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, they matter, just like it actually matters who you vote for. For Greens, people matter. All people matter. Our communities matter, because the only way we flourish as people and families is when we're an active, engaged, and welcomed part of our communities. And our natural world matters. Why, Madam Speaker? Because it's what gives us life. Can't live outside of it. We're embedded in it. And it provides a hospitable and healthy environment in which to live and raise our families. The Premier conveniently compartmentalizes people, he compartmentalizes communities, and he compartmentalizes nature. Some people good, others bad. Can't work with First Nations, can work with others. Some communities good, others can be sacrificed, like if fracking occurs, or ignored, like communities in northern New Brunswick. When it comes to nature, nature in parks, good. Nature outside of parks, disposable. Le gâchis dans lequel nous nous trouvons aujourd'hui n'est pas le fait d'un seul gouvernement. Il a fallu des gouvernements conservateurs et libéraux successifs pour nous amener au point de rupture. But, Mr. Speaker, it is this Premier, Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, it is this Premier and this Cabinet that at this moment in history, at this moment in our history, that have the responsibility to lead us back from the brink, to fix things that are broken, Madam Speaker, to stand up for New Brunswickers, to give them hope that there's a vision and a plan, a roadmap to solve some of our greatest challenges, rather than the announcement of puny programs to provide headlines that make it sound like they're actually taking bold action when there's little action at all. We need actual action, Madam Speaker, like the institution of a guaranteed livable income to solve the problem of poverty in New Brunswick, Madam Speaker, which is a wicked, wicked problem affecting so many families in so many corners of our province. Governments have a moral duty, Madam Speaker, to protect and empower people. The Premier likes to think of the people as his consumers, as if he was running a private corporation, Madam Speaker. But a private corporation has no such moral duty to citizens. That's the responsibility of government, Madam Speaker, and whether he likes it or not, the Premier is leading a government, not a corporation. You would think that after 2 years of governing, the Premier's throne speech would lay out a roadmap to shore up our crumbling healthcare system, to replenish the shrinking supply of affordable housing, to rescue people from deep poverty, Madam Speaker, which is getting worse, to buffer people from the cost of living crisis, and to boldly respond to the climate crisis. But no, it's as if the Premier is living on a different planet altogether. As the economist Richard Saillant recently said, this government has opted to sit on the sidelines, watching its fiscal position improve dramatically while largely leaving New Brunswickers alone to bear the brunt of adjusting to disruptive change. And that's how people feel, Madam Speaker. As I traveled around the province before the legislature sat, whether it was Belledune or Dieppe, Sussex or St. John, that's what I was hearing. C'est une honte. C'est une abrogation du devoir moral que le gouvernement a envers les citoyens du Nouveau-Brunswick. Mais c'est pire que cela. Le discours du Trône s'engage à des réductions d'impôts importants, privant les patients et les personnes âgées de l'argent nécessaire à de meilleurs soins. I don't understand why the Premier thinks he can afford to cut revenue when the needs are so great. Think of poverty. Think of homelessness, Madam Speaker. Think of the need to pay our nurses more for working in our ERs and ICUs, or for doing the jobs of 2 or 3 nurses when they're working short, in order to keep them employed, to keep them from leaving the bedside, which so many nurses have been doing, Madam Speaker, leaving the bedside to find careers elsewhere or practice nursing in other ways, like travel nursing, Madam Speaker, which provides them with a much higher salary and a much less stressful job. I don't understand, Madam Speaker, how the Premier can afford to cut revenue when the budget is inadequate, wholly inadequate, to properly care for seniors living in long-term care, where the wages there are so low that recruitment and retention of qualified workers is heading into a downward spiral, and that reflects so badly on the care that can be provided to our seniors and our frail elders, Madam Speaker, because, of course, the ability of the people working in nursing homes, nurses, nursing assistants, LPNs, and personal service workers is totally dependent on their numbers to be able to serve the residents well. Dans un rapport sévère de l'Association francophone des aînés du Nouveau-Brunswick intitulé « Veiller dans l'indifférence et l'indignité du Nouveau-Brunswick », des exemples choquants de négligence sont décrits. Le rapport souligne que c'est comme si le droit à la dignité humaine s'arrêter lorsque vous êtes âgé. Qui a décidé, Madame le Président, que votre vie a plus de valeur à la soixantaine qu'à l'âge de 80 ans? The report of the Francophone Seniors Association makes 6 recommendations, Madam Speaker, all good recommendations, all intended to avoid the storm in our long-term care homes that they see coming as we see more and more employees leaving and the difficulty in recruiting additional employees increases. But, Madam Speaker, the report was released in June. Has there been a response? No. Nothing. No action. In fact, it's got to the point now where the Child, Youth and Seniors Advocate announced to the Committee on Accessibility, the Standing Committee on Accessibility the other day in this building, that he is launching his own inquiry into long-term care. It's much needed, and, Madam Speaker, we have an obligation in this legislature to take his recommendations when they come seriously and do our best to ensure that the government, and when I speak of government, Madam Speaker, people sort of get lost about what's the government. Well, the government in our system, Madam Speaker, is the Premier and Cabinet. The Premier and Cabinet. The other MLAs are private members on the government side, Madam Speaker, just as we are all our private members. And they have agency as private members just as we have agency as private members, Madam Speaker. So the government is the Premier and Cabinet, and that's what I'm talking about when I use that term. Economist Richard Saillant recently wrote that the provincial government now has the fiscal flexibility. What a term, fiscal flexibility. In other words, they have the money to address our most pressing concerns, starting with housing, affordability, and health care. But he says what's missing from the speech from the throne, in his view, is the vision and ambition to do so. And that's clear, Madam Speaker. That's clear. Because what New Brunswickers were looking for sure, was a roadmap to hope in the speech from the throne. So, and hope is all about actually taking action to change things, to tackle our challenges, to solve problems, to make life better for New Brunswickers. That's what hope is. It's not being optimistic about the future, which is what the Premier seems to be saying in his throne speech. Optimism is just based on hoping things work out by themselves, and he apparently thinks things are going to work out by themselves. That's not the case. People need hope, and this needed to be a roadmap to hope, and the Premier did not deliver. Est-ce qu'en est-il de l'environnement, Madame la Présidente? Où sont la vision et l'ambition ici? En fait, nous ne pouvons pas vivre en dehors de cet environnement. C'est ce qui rend la vie possible. C'est ce qui fournit des conditions de vie hospitalière. Madam Speaker, growth in the production and consumption of fossil fuels is at such a scale that the carbon waste created when they are burned has destabilized our climate and acidified our ocean waters. And as that grows, it only gets worse. This guarantees that our children will inherit a far more inhospitable environment, and in some areas it will just be uninhabitable unless we actually act boldly, Madam Speaker. So what is the Premier's response to the climate crisis brought on by the overuse and overproduction of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, gasoline, and coal? His response is he wants to bring fracking back to produce more natural gas, Madam Speaker. He wants to expel the fossil fuels into the atmosphere that are currently safely buried under the ground in New Brunswick, securely isolated from our environment and from the atmosphere by the bedrock and aquifers above them. In doing so, they'll spew more carbon waste into the air when they're burned, along with the methane that will leak out during the fracking process. It's unacceptable. It will make the climate crisis worse. C'est pure folie, Madame la Présidente, pure folie. Je ne comprends pas la motivation de la Première ministre. First Nations yesterday issued a news release saying that they remain opposed to reopening fracking exploration. And this came from all the Mi'kmaq, all of the Loistikwe across this province, Madam Speaker, including Copet Lodge at Ossiboktok. So they remain opposed to reopening fracking exploration, Madam Speaker, and I guess it's best summed up by the quote from Chief Rebecca Knockwood of Memramcook. I've got to practice that. My apologies to the people of Fort Folly First Nation. But she said, there is no evidence this province can develop this gas supply responsibly in a way that upholds its responsibilities to the treaties. Pretty clear, Madam Speaker. Pretty crystal clear. Incredibly, the Throne speech makes the absurd claim that the natural gas trapped in New Brunswick's shale rock doesn't contain carbon, that's somehow different from natural gas everywhere else on the planet. I was gobsmacked when I read that, Madam Speaker. How could the Premier or anyone else in his government think that that was the case? Natural gas is basically methane, Madam Speaker, an extremely potent greenhouse gas in itself, even before it's burned, and it leaks when you frack, and it leaks from pipelines, and it leaks from the way it's transported, Madam Speaker, going into the atmosphere. But methane, it's CH4, Madam Speaker, and what does the C stand for? Carbon. Carbon stands for carbon. A little chemistry, little chemistry lesson here. So when it's burned, it spews carbon dioxide. The only way to avoid this, Madam Speaker, is to keep the gas in the ground, where it's safe. Safety first, Madam Speaker, keep it in the ground. En parlant de sécurité, Madame la Présidente, l'engagement du Premier ministre envers l'énergie nucléaire qu'il partage avec les libéraux est mystifiant. L'énergie nucléaire représente une menace nucléaire. Et il soutient les PRM qui fonctionneraient avec du plutonium. Le plutonium, Madame la Présidente, plutonium is the most dangerous, toxic, and radioactive element in the periodic table, bar none. Plutonium is what's used to make nuclear weapons. Like the Liberals, the Premier wants to build small plutonium-burning power plants in New Brunswick and export them around the world. Just the perfect gift, Madam Speaker, for a terrorist group or a dictator looking for some geopolitical leverage. It's unbelievable. Madam Speaker, nuclear power is a nuclear threat, and the nuclear waste associated with it is highly radioactive and will stay that way for over 10,000 years. It can leak, it can be stolen, and it can be used to kill. There's nothing clean about it. Le soleil, le vent et l'eau sont des sources d'énergie éternelles, Madame la Présidente. Elles sont facilement disponibles au Nouveau-Brunswick, gratuites et propres. Au lieu d'être le fer de lance de la transition vers ces sources d'énergie éternelles, renouvelables et propres, le Premier ministre est déterminé à augmenter la production de sources d'énergie non renouvelables, polluantes et radioactives. Quelle stratégie! Madam Speaker, this Throne speech has the feel of that old joke. You've probably heard of it. It's not a great joke, but maybe appropriate in this case. It goes this way. As a plane load of passengers was on its final descent into an airport in New Brunswick, the flight attendant was heard to say, We're now arriving in New Brunswick. Please turn your watches back to 1950. That's what this throne speech feels like, Madam Speaker. Plutonium reactors was the dream of the 1950s, when we were going to live atomically, Madam Speaker. The 1950s was the time when we didn't have equal opportunity, Madam Speaker. The 1950s was a time, Madam Speaker, when the deep poverty was extraordinary in this province. We've got a local governance reform and planned amendments to the Regional Service Delivery Act that might take us a little back in that direction as well. The Premier and his Cabinet are downloading provincial responsibilities onto what amounts to a new level of government embedded in regional service commissions. This has kind of been done by stealth, as everyone focused on the creation of the new municipalities, trying to learn the names of those. You see that Elections New Brunswick published ads, Madam Speaker, encouraging people to vote in these new municipalities using the new names. I'm not sure that anyone actually knows where those particular places are. It's unfortunate that they weren't identified by the communities that they contain. In any event, Madam Speaker, people are largely unaware of what's happening at the level of the Regional Services Commission. Ne vous y trompez pas, et cela érodera l'égalité des chances au Nouveau-Brunswick, forçant les municipalités à se faire concurrence sur les taux d'imposition alors qu'elles luttent pour s'acquitter de ce qui a été des responsabilités provinciales. Provincial responsibilities that used to be provincial, Madam Speaker, for a long time, that's housing, was abandoned by successive governments about 20 years ago. In the face of the affordable housing crisis today, the Premier has created a new portfolio for housing for the Minister of Service New Brunswick. And Madam Speaker, we've called for government to re-engage on housing policy, so they can address things like the affordable housing crisis. That's actually the reason, Madam Speaker, that the New Brunswick Housing Corporation was created in the 1970s, was to address the terrible affordable housing crisis. There was such a shortage that government itself decided to create a Crown Corporation to help ensure that nonprofits, co-ops, and others were developing affordable housing, non-market housing that people could afford. And they played a tremendous role as a facilitator, as a catalyst, as a partner in doing so, and we saw dramatic growth as a result of New Brunswick Housing Corporation, which had its own minister, dramatic growth in the supply of affordable housing to the benefit of so many New Brunswickers today, or then, Madam Speaker, and some of that extends to today, with the co-ops that were created back then continue benefiting their tenants who are not having to pay market rents, who are not living in market-based buildings. And in fact, I'm not sure, Madam Speaker, whether you know how co-op housing works, but tenants sit on the board of directors. It's they who are the board of directors and make decisions about how the buildings are run and about what kind of rent they need to pay. The problem, though, Madam Speaker, with this announcement of the creation of a minister responsible for housing is that they have no staff dedicated to that. They're over at the Department of Social Development, as far as I know. They have no legislative authority either, Madam Speaker, for housing. That rests with the Minister of Social Development, who is responsible for the New Brunswick Housing Act. And it was the New Brunswick Housing Act, Madam Speaker, that set up the New Brunswick Housing Corporation, which also rests over the Department of Social Development. So, Madam Speaker, without moving all of that over to the Minister of Housing, it's unclear to me how this is going to make any difference. It is troubling, Madam Speaker, that the throne speech did not include a commitment to extending the rent cap for New Brunswickers. That's really inexplicable when you think of it. Nothing has changed. As you can tell, I'm sure, you, Madam Speaker, the other members in this House have been receiving panicked emails and calls from tenants who have received notices from their landlords that their rent is going to take a huge jump. For many, a jump that they can't afford as soon as we get to January, because the current rent cap is scheduled to disappear New Year's Eve. So, Madam Speaker, the rent cap needs to be extended. It's clear. The same reasons the government brought the rent cap in last year, unfortunately, with legislation that essentially evaporates after the year, has not changed. Now, the commitment, though, in the legislation was to review it. So, time's up. Time's up. The review, I'm sure, has been completed for a long time by now. And it should have been completed in time for the throne speech, so that commitment could be made to put the minds of seniors, the minds of young people, the minds of families at rest. At rest, Madam Speaker. This government, the former government too as well, talked a lot about trying to keep seniors in their homes as long as possible, and have instituted various programs and supports and budget lines to help keep seniors in their homes. But, Madam Speaker, if they can't afford the rent, they're not staying in their homes. They're out. And to where? Which is a scary thing for many. I get those fearful calls frequently, Madam Speaker. And it's hard. It's hard when there's so few apartments that are affordable to offer meaningful help. The throne speech talks about all the apartments that are being built, Madam Speaker, but they are high-end. They're meeting a high-end market. Madam Speaker, New Brunswick's seen a lot of history. The colonization of First Nations, the participation in the cultural genocide of Indigenous people, the eviction of Acadians from their communities along the Woolstook and the shores of Bay of Fundy and its tidal rivers, followed by their deportation. What's missing, Madam Speaker, from this throne speech is any sense of an overriding respect for the peoples of New Brunswick. There's no recognition of the treaty and Aboriginal rights of the First Nations, no announcement of an independent process to ensure those rights are accommodated. So when those rights are infringed upon, Madam Speaker, the Premier remains the chief decision-maker, the decider-in-chief, and that's just not right. Le discours du Trône ne contient aucune affirmation des droits des francophones inscrits dans la Constitution du Canada. Et le discours du Trône ne contient certainement pas de fouille de route pour donner vie à ces droits. Le Premier ministre n'a toujours pas osé répondre aux recommandations des commissaires qui ont examiné la loi sur les langues officielles. C'est un manque de respect, Madame la Présidente. Dans un commentaire pour Radio-Canada fait par Michel Leblanc, elle a dit « Avec ce discours de Trône résolument conservateur, le Premier ministre veut clairement laisser sa marque sur le Nouveau-Brunswick, une province où l'entreprise privée peuvent la voir, notamment pour résoudre les problèmes qui paralysent les systèmes de santé ainsi que ceux qui touchent les domaines du logement et de l'éducation. The one clear message, Madam Speaker, the one clear message in this speech is that the Premier intends to drive a clear agenda of privatization in the public sector. The Premier's solution to the health care crisis opened the door to corporatization of our health care system, outsource surgeries, and beggar our hospitals for staff, Madam Speaker. There's an e-visit New Brunswick in New Brunswick, e-visit New Brunswick, which is run by Maple, the company that counts Loblaws among its investors. Then there's HealthLink New Brunswick, the network for patients without a family doctor that will be managed by Medavie. Meanwhile, we're subsidizing nursing education at a private American university rather than enhancing the capacity of our nursing schools at U2M and UMB. The Health Minister even says he's fielding business proposals for what services could be provided in privately owned clinics, just as the RHAs are expanding access and capacity for surgeries of all kinds in this province. Madam Speaker, as Greens, we believe the role of government in society is fundamentally a moral one. It isn't to serve corporate wants for maximizing profits, but to serve citizens' needs to protect and empower. Greens will always act in the interest of the common good. We believe everyone matters and that the well-being of everyone is paramount, and we will act that way. We must spend the money necessary to strengthen public services, not starve them. But that is the direction the throne speech is taking us, Madam Speaker. We need a roadmap that sets us on the path to transformational change, change by design, change that is just, and change that is long overdue. And Madam Speaker, the Greens have just such a plan. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask the page